First time in about a dozen years that I've spoken to Stanfordville and at the library, which is great. Also, Kathy, for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's nice. It's nice that everybody's here today to listen. And I like to start with that there are definitely things that are news from the Civil War. And just in case you didn't think so, here's a copy of the Civil War news for September of this year. So you can get the news from the Civil War at any given time. And a lot of this that you see today is going to be news to people from Stanford because most folks don't know this. And I know that when I started the project in 1992, I didn't know any of it. And I went from a passing interest in the Civil War to pretty much being a reenactor and a historian and enjoying it to the fullest that you could possibly do it while I did it. The song you just listened to was called Frog in the Well, which is a great marching tune, which most of us who've done reenacting have marched to a number of different times. But what I'm going to start with right now is this image in particular and ask if anybody knows where that is. Would that be a no? That's a trick question because it's not in Stanfordville, it's in Poughkeepsie. And that's in Harrison Street in Poughkeepsie, and that's the point of this presentation is because this man right here is William Gurney, who lived on Bull's Head Road. And he was my 3 times great uncle. To the left, holding onto the bicycle, is my great grandfather, and his name is Asa Arnold. That would be him right here. So that's Will Gurney's house. He's holding on to his Montgomery Ward bicycles, and this is roughly 85 to 90, right in that time frame. So figure about 20 years removed from the Civil War, where he was a corporal in Company C of the 150th New York, the Dutchess County Regiment. I had this in my possession for some 20 years before I knew who it was and what he had done. And then I found it and I was like, oh my gosh, So anyway, there's Will Gurney. And we're going to talk a little bit about Will Gurney as we go. But first of all, let's go into Stanford a little bit. Stanford, can you see this? Is it clear?
Yep.
Okay. Part of the Great Nine Partners Grant, and at one point, fixed at the hip to Washington. In 1793, we split apart and became the town of Stanford with our own government, our own representatives, and all that kind of thing. And at about the time of the Civil War, the population here was roughly 1,950 people. Of those people, by 1850 in the census, it showed that there were about 240 people listed as the head of household as farmers. Another 200 and some odd, 86 people, were listed as laborers, which meant they worked on the farms. So you don't see very much except for masons, drovers, millers, carpenters, that sort of thing. And of course the Ansons were rifle makers. And they lived on Anson Road. There you go. We had 5 physicians in town at that time, one of whom was Cornelius Campbell, who lived right next door. And let's see, 2 tailors, a shoemaker, a weaver. It's wonderful. It all changes by 65. In 65, suddenly, there's 53 laborers, head of households that are laborers. It goes down from 286. It goes up a little bit more in the way of farmers, but it's very much an agricultural community. It hasn't changed. And the thing that's most interesting to me was that we had at least 80 guys that were native-born guys that went off to the Civil War. Of those 80 that went off to the Civil War, 33 died in the service. Now, altogether, we have 140 is the number that's on the monument, but that includes people that all came in. We decided we couldn't, at that time, we could not ignore all those people. So we included them in as the whole. So we have guys from the 14th Brooklyn in there. We have guys from the 30th New York. A number of different units, 27th Connecticut, a number of different units that are out-of-town units. So they're included as our whole because they're buried in our ground. So Stanford has changed quite a bit. There was a number of things during the war that happened that weren't just about the guys. And before I go into the soldiers and what happened with the fellows who lost their lives or served in different places, there was also a Ladies Soldiers Aid Society. And they did quite a bit, in that they put together bandages, they put together socks, they put together different foodstuffs that they could send to the soldiers. And they also, at one point, it's listed in the Dutchess County history as a big raffle for a decorated cake that they held in Mabbittsville. They had 400 conscriptors raise $100 at 25 cents a share, and somebody from Thorndale won it, which is really kind of amusing. But it's one of the very few things that you can actually find about the ladies and what they did. But they were very busy also, I'm sure of it. Many of the names that we find in Stanford on the rosters and on the old maps, and this is an 1870 map of Stanford, are very familiar. Wing, Haight, Arnold, Robinson, Butts. There's quite a few people that their families have been here for many years. And thank God for these maps and for census material, because that's given us a lot of the help that we need. So when the census material comes to your door, please mark it and let them know you're here. That helps historians to know who lived where and when. Here are some people who lived here at the time. These are all Quakers, and as luck would have it, these are my family members. On the upper left is Levi Arnold, and that's his wife. On the right, that's Amy Haight Arnold. So for years, I used to tell Eric and Irv Haight, "Hi, cuz, how are you?" Because they were married into the family at one point. Down on the lower left is Mary Millay Arnold, and she is my 3 times great-grandmother. And this is her brother-in-law here, and his name is Asa Arnold, A-Z-A Arnold. He's buried up behind the Congregational Church. All these photographs were taken roughly 1860 or thereabout. They were all prosperous farmers, and every one of them was a Quaker. That's one of the interesting things about Will Gurney, is that he was also a Quaker. And if you know anything about Quakers, it was very unusual for a Quaker to fight in the war. And we had 5 from Stanfordville. It's a little bit fuzzy. This is Nathan Preston. Now, he's another one that I sort of think is an uncle, but I'm not really sure because I haven't made the tie-in anyplace. But the back of this photograph was marked Uncle Nathan in pencil. Uncle Nathan, his sister was married into the family, I know. But he was living in New York City and joined the 90th New York Volunteers. They were part of the 18th Corps. And they did a lot of different things down around New Orleans, the Red River Campaign, the assault on Port Hudson. And they were in pretty much the same places that the 128th Duchess Columbia was. So we have about 9 to 10 of his, I'm not sure of his letters. So I can get copies if we don't have, I thought I might have left some here. But some of them are pretty interesting. And I can read a little bit later as we go through it. But at one point, I can tell you that when the 90th came up with that corps, they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue because they missed the Grand Review, and they stacked arms right in the street. And they gave free cheers, for the president, and out came President Johnson. And he writes in one of his letters, "I had to shake hands with the President Johnson, and I think he's quite a trump." So Nathan Preston is buried in the Baptist Cemetery just past the restaurant. And that, as a matter of fact, that cemetery, that's the First Baptist Cemetery. And he refers to it in his letters as the Evergreen Cemetery. So you might want to bear that in mind. It's probably a good way to differentiate the 2 different cemeteries. This is from the church steeple at the Church of Christ, the Congregational Church. And what's interesting to me about it, other than that the road is still as it has always been, but if you look up in the hills to the north of Stanfordville, they're pretty much denuded, which tells you that this has been from 100 and some odd years of fossil fuel. It's hard to remember sometimes that it was a world that was lit by fire. They didn't have electricity until sometime after the Civil War, except for in the old ways in the the Morse code and the telegraph. But they would have to burn it, they would have to build with it, they had to all kinds of things with it, and that's why the hills look like this. And now, of course, they don't look like that anymore. And some of these buildings are gone now that are behind the old Tarrant House. But I always like this as a good illustration of what happens over a period of time. Now, here's another image from the belfry, and it's looking in the opposite direction. And what I really like about this one, of course, is there's the Case General Store. It's opposite the Congregational Church, or was at one point. There's somebody there with his wagon with stuff, and there's a lady with packages going down the road. And over here on the Poughkeepsie and Eastern line, it's probably about 9 or 10 in the morning, is a train going down the tracks. They're heading north, opposite Wappingers Creek. So I really, down here is Gristmill Lane, and you can see where the old mill was. The interesting thing about this particular general store, and I got this mark from your mom, this was a great story your mom told me, it caught on fire, and it was sometime around the First World War when we didn't have a fire department at that time. There was no volunteers, so they had to call Millbrook for their volunteers to come over and put out the fires. Except somebody grabbed a bucket full of kerosene and threw it on the fire thinking it was water, so this thing burned to the ground, which is really too bad because it's a great old building. There is a house on the spot today, though. When I grew up, this particular station was right in the middle of Long's Lumber Yard. Now, the railroad didn't come into Stanford until about 1866, so after the Civil War. Didn't come in until 1866, and right here, these old fellas, it looks like it's the 4th of July. There's a lot of bunting and things around the station, and they've got their old pop guns there. Those are small signal guns. Incidentally, at the end of the war, Isaac Sands, who was a town councilman, was one of the first people who got the message that the war was over and they had won. His son went to his house and pulled out a signal gun and put black powder in it and set it off, and it blew up and took his hand. So it was a dark day for the Sand family. But these fellows were apparently a rare bunch. I had it from my grandmother when she showed me this. Oh, they were a bunch of characters. What they would do is they would go up on Sisters Hill Road, and on top of the hill on the right opposite the coffin house, there's a big lake up on the top of the hill up there. You remember that, Mark? If you ever hunted up there, you would know. And they would go up there and whoop it up and shoot off guns and drink a little Who Hit John. And they were a bunch of rowdy characters. Some of that doesn't usually get through over the years, but it made it through to me. And here we have a picture of the town highway crew setting the precedent for the next several decades. Standing around watching the camera. It is a road grader. I think this is in Bangor, somewhere near where the post office is. It's the only place I can think that sort of fits that image. And they're standing there with their shovels and hanging around. They come up in other photos. This one, I think, also is a courtesy of Brian Robertson, who had a very large collection of the photographs of Edgar Hyatt, whom we're really indebted to over the years because he cataloged Stanford. A lot of its people, a lot of the places, and this is one of his images. Anybody know where that is? That's right, Bangor. Right in front of what was the name of that when it was a restaurant? I wasn't here when it was a restaurant, so. The Whaling Company, exactly, yes. And it was Churton's, and it was Lucy's, and it was Cows's at various times. And this is just a great shot because it's a very nice looking horse and a buggy cantering down the road. And how they managed to catch it without it being too blurred was a good thing. By the way, this particular overhead we've had for a very long time, probably about 12 years, and we're hoping that we get through it and that the bulb lives. So if it dies, we might have to be passing photographs around so that you can see them. This is on Gristmill Lane, and this is the grist mill that was there at one time. So the bridge would be right about here, right in this area. Then there's this, and there was a little clapboard house. So this building was either torn down or burned down a very long time ago, but it's a great building. I think this is when they were rebuilding the bridge after a flood, which is why the big beams are there. But that was a grist mill, thus the name, Gristmill Lane. We had some 7 different mills in Stanford at different places. Grist mills, paper mills, cider mills. There was a number of different ones. Here's another one. This is the axle factory. And this is off of Trestle Lane. And in the back is the old Gahuli house up on the hill. So if you know where that old falls is on the Wappingers Creek down there, that's the axle factory, which is, of course, completely gone now. I think you can go back there and still see some sprockets in the ground. But I haven't been back there in a long time, and I was there to fish back then, so I didn't pay much attention. This was in Bengal. Matter of fact, if you could superimpose a photograph from today on this picture, you'd see that the cannon is right about here. So this is all gone, of course. It was there when I was a kid, and it was an apartment building. But back at this time, it was the Bengal Hotel. We think that probably sometimes they had rallies outside of this. There definitely was a tap room down below where all kinds of mischief probably went on. And over here is, of course, where the old church is, no longer there. And the other old building that's on the side. So that was also the Hicks Hotel, and I think Gurdon Tripp was an old German gent who was running it at the time, which is where this one comes in. And I think this might be Mrs. Tripp. I'm not really sure. If you can read out on the bottom, it says, "The cup that cheers, but don't inebriate." So I'm assuming that's tea. It's a great picture of her anyway. They had a sense of humor. This image is of the grounds where the Congregational Church is. Now I'm doing all this to set up, this is a little of what Stanford was at one time. And these are some of the people that were there. And in the background, you can see the windows of the Congregational Church over on the left. And here are some of the people that went to school there to this is schoolhouse number 1, I believe. And amongst all those people in this picture are two people of interest to me. One of them is my grandmother, Mary Arnold Henry, right there. And the other one is Mrs. Taylor. And there's an interesting story of New York, which is called the Ulster Guard. At the beginning of the war, as I said, a lot of different units sprang up. Some were Zouave units, some were regular militia units. This was one of the militia units, and this was in Kingston. We had 7 fellows from Stanford who enlisted in this. They went over to Washington, D.C. at the outset as a 3-month regiment, and then they came back and they redesignated them the 80th New York, which they fought for the next 3 years, and they still went by the 20th New York. However, our guys were with them. When we did the monument, one of the figurines, and I let Peter decide this, I really didn't want to, he was the artist. We had 2 guys that I said that I would like to use in the monument, either Cornelius Campbell or Amos Travis. Amos Travis was a corporal of the color guard of the 20th. The 20th was involved in Bull Run, second Bull Run, where they really got shot up. And then the second one at Antietam in the Miller farmyard in the cornfield. Now, Amos Travis, being a corporal of the color guard, was next to the flag when the flag went down. 2 people went down, shot down, and then Amos went to pick the flag up, and when he picked it up, he was shot through. He lasted another several weeks, and then he died. So to me, it was like, it's either got to be Cornelius Campbell or it's got to be Amos Travis, one of the 2. And he picked Campbell because he was supervisor, he was very well known, and he just liked the idea of doing Campbell. Well, I don't know if he didn't like the idea of doing a color. But these days, when I see people handling colors in the flag so badly, I think of people like this, particularly this young man from Stanford, one of the first that we lost during the war, and dying to pick up the flag, and dying a hard death too. The 20th went on from here, and they were at Gettysburg. Later on, they got down to battalion size, and they were pretty much a provost guard, but they were there pretty much throughout the whole war, and they were a strong unit and considered, I think, among the top 300. From Stanford, we also had 2 veterans of color, 2 black veterans who joined the 14th Rhode Island. Now, at the time that the 14th was mustering, the 54th Massachusetts was also mustering. We kind of, hypothesized that they were going to go there. Then probably their companies were filled up. They ended up down in Providence and in this artillery unit. They were shipped south to New Orleans along with a lot of the other units that went down there. And somehow when they started what was called at the time the Corps d'Afrique, which was mostly black soldiers, or what they called colored troops at the time, they shifted over to the 11th New York Heavy Artillery, colored. Edward and Johnny Frazier were the two fellows that went down there with them. And they were both from Stissing Lane here in Stanford. Johnny contracted typhoid and died, and he's buried in a soldier's grave there. We don't know where. Several years back, when they put a monument to the black troops up in Washington, D.C., I was contacted about these two fellows. Were they definitely from Stanford? And I said, yes. So you can go to that particular monument today and see Edward and John Frazier's name on it, which I'm really happy about. This is what's interesting to me about this particular painting is it shows the 14th Rhode Island in review, and because they're black soldiers, it shows their back. What can you do? It was the times. We understand and we know. There we go. In 1862, President Lincoln called for 300,000 more volunteers. And the call went up far and wide around New York State, and two regiments particularly showed up from Dutchess County, the 128th, which was the Dutchess Columbia Regiment, and the 150th, which was all Dutchess County. Now, there were some folks from Connecticut and smatterings of other places in there. But we had in Company C, over the course of the 3 years that they served, we had about 56 guys from Stanford serve in the 150th. Amongst those, of course, to us, the most interesting is Cornelius Campbell, who was first surgeon and a major. And we have some images of Cornelius, because he was quite a guy. The interesting thing about this poster is you have come see Captain Crummy and Lieutenant Lowe, neither of which ever served in the regiment. One of them, I think, got arrested later on, and another one went off to the cavalry. So neither one of them ended up in there. And it talks about all these wonderful bounties that you can get. $100 from Poughkeepsie, $50 from the county, $50 from the state, and another $25 when you muster in. That would have been a fortune in those days. Plus, Stanford said that they would give $100 per person, anybody who enlisted in this time frame. We don't have any proof that anybody ever got any of those monies. We don't know. There's nobody ever wrote down, oh, I received my check from Stanford today. You just can't find that kind of thing. But it's nice that they offered the incentive, because it was a pretty tough time. At this point in the Civil War in 1862, it was a tough time to go in, because they'd already seen the photos from the front, and the stories were coming back of how hard it was to get hit by a lead ball. Here are some images of from some fellows in the Dutchess County Regiment. That's Ira Fish on the left with his Austrian Lorenz rifle. He was a sergeant. I don't know what company offhand. Aye. So quits. Come on, you guys are 150th guys. Come on. You're killing me. No, this is also here is John Henry Ketchum from Dover. He was the first colonel. And there's some interesting stuff about John Henry Ketchum. He later became a representative from Dover for this particular district. And the theory is that he was deafened by the artillery at Gettysburg, because the regiment was in such close proximity to the shelling from Powers Hill and from that area, and that he was so close that he lost his hearing, or at least he became hard of hearing. Fast forward to when the regiment is in front of Savannah, and the colonel is walking along on the parapets as if nothing's happening. And he gets shot in the leg by a sharpshooter from the rebels outside of Savannah. And that's it for his service for the 150th. He comes back and he runs for Congress and all that kind of thing. And he's there for the next, I think, something like 8 different, I think he did 8 different terms, 2-year terms as a congressman. And there's something really, to me, it makes me really happy to think that he sat in Congress for all those years and didn't hear a thing. Down here is Alfred Baker Smith. Pardon me?
But never missed a vote.
Never missed a vote, yes, and he was good for his district. I know Will Gurney loved him because he got him a job in the post office in the 1890s. In any case, down here is Alfred Baker Smith. He was the second colonel. At one point during the course of the war, and they're outside of Savannah, he's taken over. He's a lieutenant colonel of the regiment at the time. and he spies across the river none other than Daniel Guernsey, who started out as a private. He was from Stanford, and at this point he was a captain. He was promoted right up the ranks and was a captain. He says, I spy on the other side Daniel Guernsey. I was surprised to see him over there. But he saw him, and he knew. And it's when you find these little random references to people from town, and it really kind of cracks you up.
Guernsey was with the Confederates?
No, Guernsey was a captain in the 47th New York, the Washington Grays, and they did most of their fighting around the James Island, and they were at one point down in Alusty and fought a really terrific retreat action down there. They were a terrific unit, but they had a hard time. What I'm interested in here, this is from the Poughkeepsie Eagle, up here, mass meeting in Bangor. Now, it's hard to imagine a mass meeting in Bangor at any point, but back then, when you had one, that was a big deal. This was on August 25th, and the 150th and 128th are still recruiting at that point. The 128th would go get mustered in and move out, I think, on the 6th of September, and the 150th didn't go out until the October 11th. Both units had problems pulling in people at this time of the year because you got to remember, they're all farmers. And what time of year is it? Harvest. So guys are coming in, they're signing up, and then they're leaving, and there are people like, where are these guys going? They were all going back to help Dad on the farm or whoever. So the 128th had the problem, the 150th had the problem. They've started to put guards around the camps. They started to close things down so guys couldn't go. So then guys got the idea, okay, do the harvest first, then go sign up. But a lot of times, different companies came from specific towns. So for instance, Company A was from the Harlem Valley, mostly Amenia, Dover, down in that area. They were the first company mustered in, thus Company A. So if you look at if you take a look at the old books, you'll see the towns are the Northeast, Amenia, et cetera, Stanford was the third company in Company C. So you'll see a lot of Clinton, some Pleasant Valley, and a lot of Stanford people in Company C. In any case, right on here, you'll see all the people who are involved with their committees for the war. It's Albert Knapp, or rather, is that Amos Knapp, rather? That would be a relative of yours. He was Vice President Phineas Wing. Let's see, C.N. Campbell is on there. Let's see, Hiram Tripp. A number of folks, all these folks who are very familiar once you start doing the kind of paperwork through town and figure out who people were. And this is where they come up with the $100 that they're going to give out to people if they just sign up. And they did initially. Stanford sent 36 or some such number as that.
Where was the 120th at?
Upstate a little bit, and I believe across the river, Coxsackie, that area. North of Kingston, yeah, north of that area. Yeah, good regiment too. 120th was a good regiment. They show up in a lot of histories from some of the bigger battles. This is Isaac Carpenter. He's a state representative. He was a town supervisor at different times. This is from the Dutchess County history of 1882, the Smiths. And he's also involved in the recruitment and everything. Doesn't take too active a role because he's pretty old at this point, but he is involved in it, which is very nice. And so you have some people of influence. Cornelius Nace Campbell. Look familiar? Cornelius Nace Campbell is from the town of Amenia originally. He goes to New York University as a result of the offices of a lady who took an interest in him, an older lady, who wanted to see him educated, and they saw some potential. He came back up to Paulding for several years, and he settles here in Stanford in about 1848, and his home is right next door. Now, that part of your building mark is gone. That's the old part of the building. That's the original part of the building that Cornelius, I believe, lived in. This was added on probably sometime in the 1860s, I think, the front part. But he lived right next door. He's very much beloved by the regiment. He's loved particularly by the Stanford guys who knew him very well. And they speak glowingly of him, in the older post-war years, which is really, really some very nice stuff. And let me read one of them to you. Stephen Cook was one of the other MDs. for the 150th. And there was sort of a rivalry between the two of them and their respective towns, because Cook was from the town of Washington, who was going to be the regimental surgeon. They both liked each other quite a bit. They didn't really care. But Ketchum knew Campbell because he had served with him in the state legislature. And he said, it's going to be Campbell. When Campbell passed away, they had Cook write part of the thing from the regimental for him, a little bit of a testimony. And one of the things that he said was, from life's sunrise until life's sunset, he filled life's cup to the brim. Not that he was entitled to any extraordinary credit for so doing, either, for he was so constituted that he could not help it. He could not help being kind, could not help being true, could not help being honorable, could not help being just. And I thought that was a really, really sweet tribute to give to somebody, after he'd passed away. But you do see his name come up in different correspondence over the years, the kind of thing where Surgeon Campbell says that he should be okay, but he may lose a leg and that kind of thing. I believe that mass meeting took place here. There's Bullis Hall. Bullis Hall before it was refurbished. Now, I wanted to take that picture before it was refurbished, even though it had the garage door on there, so you get a little bit of an idea how it looked over the years when it came down to us. This has been at different times a cigar factory. It's been an inn. And my mom played basketball here in the 1940s. So, I mean, there's all kinds of different things that it was over the years. But I believe it was a place where the mass rally might have been held. And probably, when they made announcements and such, they came out to the balcony and let people know. I don't know how you could fit 300 people in there, because it's kind of tough, But this is probably the only spot in Stanford that you could do it. So I believe that was held right here on this open area. There's another picture of John Henry Ketchum. I particularly like that one. He's from Dover. You don't hear very much about these fellas here. Here's a picture of the Company A fellas. Now, these are all Amenia guys. Every one of them. Have I got that backwards? I think I do. Yes, I do. There you go. That's better. That's better. Whoa. There's some interesting people in this. This is Lieutenant Gridley right here, who writes a really nice diary when the regiment is down in the Tennessee and Alabama area after Gettysburg. It's very much one of these daily life things and what's going on right now with us. And it's from him that we learn how another Stanford guy got killed. And what happened was 3 Michigan soldiers had been executed by Confederate guerrillas. And their bodies dumped into the river, except one of them was alive. And when he came out on the other side, they found out that it was guerrillas near whatever the town was. So they sent several companies of the 150th to this particular town to get reparations. So what they did was they went to that town, confiscated sorghum, molasses, anything they could that was worth anything. And then they would sell it and send the money back to the families of these Michigan soldiers. So when they were coming back, after they went there and they got all this booty from this town, 2 soldiers were out in front of the 150th. And one of them was riding Campbell's horse, and that was a guy named George Lovelace. I don't remember the other guy's name. Was it? In any case, they're probably about a half mile ahead. They were told not to get too far ahead, but they did it anyway. And what happened was they ran into guerrillas. They found later when they heard the shots and they came up on them, one of them was draped over the fence dead, the other one was on the ground dead. And they had gunshots close with powder burns on their chests. And they chased after them and they got the horses back, but they couldn't catch the guerrillas. They catch them, turned the regiment around, they went back to that town and they took another $10,000 worth of goods. What else could you do, So then they came out. And it was kind of confusing for me because I found George Lovelace had been killed by guerrillas in Tennessee, but then I found out he had been captured at the Battle of Bentonville. How is it possible that he could be in both places, dead and then resurrected? It was his son, who joined the regiment later on and had the same name. So there were two George P. Lovelaces. And Lovelace's daughter also worked for Cornelius Nace Campbell as a housekeeper right next door. So it's interesting that Gridley leaves us this information because I wouldn't have known anything about how particularly he died. And the sad part about Gridley is that later on, I think it was at Peachtree Creek, he's in the front of his company, and he points out, as you know, to his riflemen, take that rebel color bearer down, which they promptly do. They shot the guy down. The Rebs were so incensed that they shot Gridley down, and Gridley died. So he's buried over in Amenia Union at the cemetery over there. I eventually found him. You've probably seen his grave, Mike. They went back down after the war, and they found him and brought him home. This is later on Sheriff Bartles. And this is Charles Borden of Borden's Milk and Condensed Milk. Same family. He's from Wassaic, as is Gridley from Wassaic. So some of the other fellows, I'm not sure who they are. But it's a good bunch. You know, they were a solid company. And you can see that they were the first ones in.
Gordon went to 47.
Say again?
Gordon left the 150th. Became an officer in 47.
Oh, is that right? In the 47th?
Yep.
The Washington Grays? Ah, on the James Island. This is the second pattern colors, regimental colors of the 150th New York. This particular color that you're looking at, this picture was taken out back here on our bicentennial when the 150th first came to Stanfordville at our request, at the Historical Society request, to commemorate our guys that we were finding served in the 150th at the time. Now, the original regimental color was up in Albany, and it was still rolled, and it was in rough shape, but it had never been, you know, restored or anything like that. The 150th Educational Association, with a little bit of a bump from the Historical Society, restored that color. You can now go and visit it at the, I think it's still up in People's Island. That's where I saw it. The only problem with it is that the eagle's head is missing. But it's the original flag, and it is absolutely, you know, still there. So it's a beautiful color. But this was the second regimental. The first regimental that they had was so shot up at Gettysburg that they couldn't use it anymore. From Company C, we have one of my favorite officers ever. And that is Henry Gildersleeve. He's the first company commander for Company C. He grew up over on Pumpkin Lane, if you've ever driven by the area. And he had a brother named Frank, who was also in the 150th and was a steward. Frank I'm going to talk about right now because I've still never found a photograph of him. But he has a fascinating history. He goes in as a steward and as a young man. He's probably 17 or 18 years old at the time. So he's following around in Campbell's footsteps and helping him at each one of the operating tables that they set up at various battlefields. At the end of the war, Frank, at, I believe, Campbell's behest, goes to NYU and in 2 years' time becomes a doctor. So he comes back. From there, he signs on with the Army and he heads out west. And when he's out west, he starts in, I think, San Francisco. Then the next thing you know, he shows up in Montana. Then he's down in Arizona in Yuma, you know. So, and this is all in like the late 1860s, early 70s. So it's a pretty crazy time frame. Think Deadwood. You know, I mean, all those crazy sharpshooters and people, they're still running around out there. And Frank is out there. He ends up in Alaska. He ends up over on the Bering Straits. He comes back down to Los Angeles. And the next place he turns up is New York City, where he's the chief surgeon in charge of building the subways. So, and then later on the Holland Tunnels. And then I lost him. I couldn't find him. I had no idea where he died or where he was buried or any of that kind of thing. But I loved his story because, I mean, here's this guy. We can't even find a photograph of him. So one of those times when I've hit like a wall, and I just decided I'm going to walk through the Church of Christ Cemetery again and see who I can find and who I've missed. And I get almost done, and I'm tired, and I'm ready to go to my car. And who do I find in the Stanford Cemetery but Frank F.B. Gildersleeve? No veteran marker, no nothing. It's like, Frank, where have you been? I've been looking. But there he is. But that's Henry's brother. Henry is great. He goes on and he has a career as a lawyer. He's one of the original members of the National Rifle Association. He's on the American rifle team, which beats England and Ireland, as a matter of fact. So he's a crack shot, this guy. And he's later on a chief justice in the courts here. So, and you'll see him later on in one of our images, from, what is it? I think it's Lookout Mountain. I think he's in that image. And he also has a daughter of some repute. His daughter goes on to become I think she's the president of, not Columbia, what's the sister? Barnard, right. And, I was telling my aunt this story, and I said, yes, Mrs. Gildersleeve, Miss Gildersleeve, because she never married, who, oh my gosh, the battle axe. Are you kidding me? And I said, oh, that's right, Columbia, because my aunt went to Columbia, and she was like, yes, I knew her. And I said, really? She goes, she was not a nice person. I was like, really? Well, part of her resume was that she was picked by Eleanor Roosevelt to be on the UN commission that drew up the UN Charter. So our history with Henry Gildersleeve is an interesting one. And I thought not only that, he's a great-looking guy. Feel free to stop me if I'm running too long on some of this stuff. 150th musters in on October 11th, and they immediately get sent down to Baltimore. And when they're in Baltimore, they ended up building their own barracks. They had to. And there it is. Belger Barracks. And this was in Camden, Maryland. Anybody else tell me what's in Camden? Ever heard of Camden Yards? Baseball stadium? Ah, there you go. Right in that area. So they were there for roughly just short of a year. They were there and they put their drills. Here they're doing a dress parade. This was one of the ways that we found out exactly what the alignment of the companies were. Company C, the Stanford company, was the color company. So they would have been right in the center. One of these, next to the colors. And in any case, you hear a lot of good stories, especially in the diaries of the fellas and things that went on there. But they were spread across Baltimore. They did garrison work at the railroad. They were in town at different ways. You got to remember at the beginning of the war, when the Massachusetts regiment tried to march through Baltimore, they were fired on and several soldiers were killed by the mob. So ever since then, people understood that this was pretty much a secesh town and you needed to garrison it. So the 150th got the honor up until Gettysburg. And at Gettysburg, when the alarms for Gettysburg spread, the 150th packed up and were on their way. That one's a little too busy. The great part about the 150th is they all wrote so well about it. And one of the people who wrote well about it was, of course, my great uncle, Will Gurney. And he wrote the bit about from Baltimore to Gettysburg. And it's pretty interesting for me, of course, because he's a relative, but the good part is he was very descriptive. I mean, he talks about how they all got blisters on their feet because they weren't used to marching. They were pretty much still a rookie regiment. They were great at drill. They knew how to do their job, but they'd never been in a firefight, never loaded their weapons, never done any of that kind of thing. So here's the Troussel farm. We're going to get into that in a few seconds. But he writes that as they take their place, and they're waiting to take their place in line with the 12th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, when he say, we were continually guyed and blackguarded by the veterans of the Army for carrying such weights on our back. And they had huge blanket rolls. They were carrying different kinds of books. So what they did right on the side of the road near Monocacy is they just dropped everything except their knapsacks and what they needed, and then they fell in line. And of course they got good blisters because they marched for so long. When they got to Gettysburg, it was on the second day of the fight, and they came in on the right side of the battlefield. And they were over in an area close to Powers Hill, from what I've understood over the years. And they became a part of the 12th Corps. And the 12th Corps was pretty much on the right side. And if you're looking at the battlefield, you know, there's the fishhook, and it's on that top of that fishhook area. So Longstreet's attack happens around 4 in the afternoon, and they sweep up diagonally across the line. And right away, they're calling for reinforcements because part of the Union forces are being overrun. Alpheus Williams attaches himself to these 2 regiments from the new brigade that got there, which included the 150th, and at a soft jog ran diagonally across the field about 1.5 miles to 2 miles, something like that, at a jog with flat-bottom shoes, which is amazing to me because they probably had guys dropping out all over. But Alpheus Williams mentions in his diaries that one of the regiments fell behind, so I stayed with it to hurry it along. The Maryland unit deployed over into the Trossel Woods, and the 150th deployed on a ridge just short of the Trossel Farm. This is the Trossel Farm. And you can see down here all the dead horses in the yardway. I'm sorry this is so grainy. There's the house itself, more dead horses. And this is where the battery, the 9th Massachusetts, Bigelow's battery was when they were overrun. It's a very famous story. It's called the retreat by prolonge or retreat by recoil. So they started up on a hill about 200, 300 yards away from the Trossel house, and as they retreated, they would fire the guns, and as much as it would recoil, then they would load it again and fire it again, and it would recoil again, and down the hill they went, firing as they recoiled, or prolonge. And they would pull it by the ropes a little bit too. They got down into the farmyard here, and the rebels were really close. At this point, they're firing pretty much nothing but canister to keep them away. And it was Whitaker's section, about 4 guns that were there. And they kept firing and letting them have it, and quite a few of them got shot down, and eventually Bigelow got away, but they left 3 of their guns, 12-pounders, here in the yardway here. Who comes across the field but the 150th New York, who sets up outside? They send 2 companies forward. The Rebs have gone and moved on off to the left and up to the battlefield, and we drew off those 3 cannon. So we saved Bigelow's guns for him. Here's a painting by myself that shows what I'm talking about here. There is the Trossel Farm. And there is the addition going on. There's the summer kitchen, which was not finished at the time. 2 companies of the 150th that went into the yardway, and they picked up cannon, and then they pushed them and pulled them out over the roadway and away from there. Brought them back and handed them back to the artillery. Here's the 150th up on a hill over here. Now I showed the colors down here because this would have been Lieutenant Colonel Bartlett. And I thought he would want to show the colors, let them be down there, let them be seen. I don't know if that happened. Probably it didn't. But I like the idea that it might have. And we don't have any documentation one way or another. So I have them there. So anyway, that's General Lockwood, that's Colonel Bartlett, and they're hustling the fellows up. Incidentally, when I was painting this, I did a lot of research on it, and the park ranger who lived there at the time was a guy named Jim Johnson. He was a Maryland guy, really nice person. Brought me in the house, took me through everything, and when I finished the painting, I gave him the very first one off the press. And we had a living history down there with the 150th at the time. And so we went over and he gave us beer, cheese, and crackers in the backyard of the Trossel house right in here. And it was a singular experience. Honestly, it was really, really nice. And Jim, I'm still in touch with Jim. He's a great guy to this day. And there's bullet holes in the house and blood stains in a couple places. So it's pretty cool to go in there. In any case, this is where the 150th first saw anything. And they ran across the field, and then they ran into here and did this, and they never loaded their weapons. Never fired a shot, never did anything. Pulled the guns off, and then started to back off, which was probably a good thing. What that's doing there. Eventually in the evening, they go back over to Culp's Hill, and they ended up the next morning in the trenches at Culp's Hill. Now this is a famous photograph from the battlefield. And who is this that took this one? This wasn't Gardner. This was the other one. What's his name? Quick.
Sullivan?
No, not Sullivan. He's always posing in the pictures.
Brady.
Matthew Brady?
Matthew Brady, yes, this is his guys that are doing this. And there they are, of course, sitting on a stone, which you can still go to and you can still sit on to this day. So when I made this painting of the 150th when they went into this, I went back and I actually sat on the stone myself. There's the stone, right over there on this side. Now this is right on, it's near the top of Culp's Hill. And if you're going up the hill in a car, you'll see a large tower-like thing. I have images of it that you can see later. But the 150th went into line early in the morning of the 3rd of July. And they fought from behind works. The works, it's in varying degrees of sizes. Some were down low, some were up high with a head log. And the fellas expended over 100 rounds each, firing over these logs. And the photographs of the trees down the hill from after the battle show incredible damage. So if you're hiding behind stones, you didn't want to move because these guys are loading and firing. Boom! Boom! And they're not even aiming. They're just firing. In any case, they're in here 3 times during the course of that morning. We lost, I believe, 7 fellas. Company C is right in this area around the flag because they were the color company. Company A is down here on the right side of the regiment. Now, we lost a couple of fellas from Stanford at this particular fight. And one of them was Levi Rust. And I find this interesting because Peter Wing was, of course, the guy who executed the statue for me. And I had to really lobby him for a long time because he didn't want to do it. And I finally found this information about Johnny Wing. Well, Johnny Wing is this young guy. He's a Wing. He's from Armenia, and he's a cousin of Peter's. Distant, but a cousin. So what happens to Johnny Wing is he's standing behind a big Stanford fella, and they're on the line, Company A, and a Reb sharpshooter from a tree opposite shoots Levi Rust. It goes through him, hits Johnny Wing. Both of them drop dead. So Peter Wing won't do this. So I said to him, if you don't do this statue for me, Johnny Wing is going to come to that damn castle and haunt you, and haunt your wife, and haunt your children until, and there was expletive deleted, and he agreed to do it. That wasn't the only reason, but that was just one of them. So I don't have that particular happenstance happening down here, but right here is Talmadge Wood. Now, Talmadge Wood is fighting behind the breastworks, and he's one of these guys he's an older guy. There's some discussion if he's 45 or if he's 55. We're really not sure. But he probably went in because he wanted to get the bounties. There was a lot of bounties, and he's listed as a laborer. I think the closest he comes to any kind of extra kind of money coming in is he's one of the supervisors of the highway, which means he goes out and he cleans a section of the road. So I don't know, maybe he gets $1 a year or something like that to do that. Not very much. His wife is a school teacher named Lydia. In any case, he's standing behind the breastworks, and he gets hit in the shoulder blade as he's reloading. He writes home later on, to his wife, I got hit in the shoulder blade. I'm feeling a little bit better, but I thought you'd want to hear from me. And Cornelius Campbell also writes to her. And I'm going to read to you what he says, because it's the only letter that we have from Campbell. As a matter of fact, this is in Mr. Grayson's collection. All the Talmadge Wood letters and Campbell's letter. This is what he says to Lydia Wood. My dear old friend, I have some sad and unwelcome news to write you. At the Battle of Gettysburg, Talmadge was wounded, and I think mortally. However, on Monday, July 6th, he was more comfortable. He was struck by a mini ball in the left breast. See how he tells him he got hit in the front? Because he didn't want the stigma attached to him that he'd been wounded while his back was to the enemy. But he was loaded. Nobody ran. He was struck by a mini ball in the left breast just below the collarbone, the ball pushing directly out through the chest, coming out beneath the shoulder blade. He was fighting behind breastworks and was shot by a rebel sharpshooter from the top of trees surrounding. After the battle, we were ordered to march and were obliged to leave all our sick and wounded behind. Lydia, I do not expect him to live, but occasionally one who is shot through will recover. There are some other things that he writes, but he says Talmadge has been a good and faithful soldier. Remember me to the good. I sympathize with you. Yours truly, C.N. Campbell. It's a very touching letter. It's very nice, and obviously he knew Lydia. Lydia, when she found out that he had passed, would live 3 more years and die in 1866. But he remains one of Stanford's 2 Gettysburg killed in action. So he didn't really kill in action. He lingered and died on the 14th. Part of the letter that Campbell wrote included that he'd left him in the good hands of Charlie Pond and John Vassar. Now, John Vassar was a cousin to the chaplain of the 150th, and I believe is the grandson of Matthew, or a brother of Matthew? Uncle. His nickname was Uncle John, and he was considered the Johnny Appleseed of the Christian Czech Society. He would be seen any place at any time, and he could be out there in a field with a farmer on his knees, praising Jesus and praying to God. He was one of those guys that was just electric. People listened to him and they loved him. So Cornelius Campbell says, I've left him with Charlie Pond, and I've seen John Vassar, who used to be out about Stanford, and asked them to look in on him and like that. The interesting thing that John Vassar made it to Gettysburg is that he almost didn't, is because he was walking from Baltimore to catch up to the regiment when he got picked up by a cavalry detachment from the Confederate Army. So they brought him in front of, guess who? Jeb Stuart. And said, they want to know, who are you? What are you doing here? Are you, a spy? And the first words out of Mr. Vassar's mouth is, General, do you love Jesus? And he kept it up with similar things like that. And finally, one of the other officers, General, we need to release this man or we'll have a sermon, all the way to Richmond. And so they got his promise that he wouldn't say anything to anybody about their whereabouts for 2 days, and off he went. And he shows up later in Gettysburg taking care of the sick and wounded. But he's around for a number of years, and he's one of those guys that, he's an obscure character in history, but it's kind of worth it to know about him. There is a book on him. You can find a book with a really nice bio. And you can find it online.
Was he a soldier?
No, he actually had worked back in Vassar's brewery in Poughkeepsie until he found God. And then he took a job, I think at $15 a month or something? No, $20 a month, working for the Track Society. And he went around spreading the word. So how cool is that? I mean, and it's a good thing he showed up there. I kind of like it. The 150th eventually, this is from the Dutchess County Historical Society, the 150th eventually they leave Lockwood's Independent Brigade and they become a part of General Ruger's brigade. We believe that this is General Ruger. Oops, wait a minute, what happened here? I believe, well, anyway, right here. And right here is Cornelius Nace Campbell. That's him. I'm pretty sure of it. But there's the star, the 5-pointed star of the 12th and later 20th Corps. And this is why I brought this along, so you can see what they would look like. This would be a private's cap, forage cap from the 150th. They had the flat top and like that. And one of the things that made it a forage cap was you could put berries and things in there. So that's one reason why they look like that. They're very comfortable, and it's very good to have them on. And they did not fold them like baseball caps. You don't see them like this. They folded them up. That's the way they did it, which is really a difference. Anyway, this is a post-Gettysburg shot, and it shows Ruger's command and his people and staff officers, and they're sitting down for a photograph. And it's interesting that Campbell is among them. He's already made a reputation for himself because he was in charge of one of the 12th Corps hospitals on the Taneytown Road. So he's quite a guy. I'm going to shift over to the 128th for a few minutes. The 128th Regiment, of course, went out on the 6th of September. As I mentioned, they went down to New Orleans, and they contracted typhus on the way down. And as they debarked around Baton Rouge, 6 Stanford guys were dead inside 4 months of typhoid. So already we've lost 7, 8 guys to disease or to war. And they're young bred, but the thing is, they're young guys. They're right off a farm. They've never been exposed to any kind of disease, and they've never been in close quarters with city kids who've been into those diseases. So the 128th, kind of a hard luck regiment, they get in there where all the diseases are. So they're down in the Red River for a period of time. They take part in the siege of Port Hudson, where they get pretty shot up in the assault on Port Hudson. After Vicksburg falls, Port Hudson surrenders, and eventually they get shipped back up to the Shenandoah, where they're behind Sheridan. One second. So Sheridan is charged by U.S. Grant to destroy the breadbasket of the Confederacy. What's the line? Make sure that a crow flying over it would have to provide his own food. Make sure everything is gone. So the 128th goes in, and they take part in the Battle of Winchester and later on Cedar Creek. And at Cedar Creek, what happened was it's a surprise attack. They've been driving the rebels for weeks. And they go right up to Cedar Creek, and they make an encampment there. And in the next morning, in the mist, Confederate soldiers dressed in blue uniforms sneak up on the pickets, walk right up to them, and capture them. 3 guys from Stanford are captured there. And let me find that image in particular. Rensselaer Mosier and George Payne are 2 of them. And they're sent down to Salisbury, which was also known as Camp Starvation. Now, these 2 fellas are down there. Now, they both already had typhoid fever in New Orleans. So they've both already been weakened, and they're already pretty much susceptible. When they got liberated from Camp Salisbury and had to walk up, George couldn't walk. So Rensselaer Mosier picked him up and carried him. He carried him all the way up to Washington, D.C. in that area, and then they caught a boat. Eventually they got up to Albany. They took another boat down and got off at Hudson, and Rensselaer Mosier carried George Payne from there to Stanford. It's one of those signal stories that is just, wow. Got the story from Dean Thomas. It's a great story, and these are both Stanford guys. I have photos of them. In any case, later on, George Payne marries Rensselaer Mosier's little sister. And they spend pretty much the rest of their lives in close proximity. So it's a nice story. This particular shot is of Sheridan at Cedar Creek. And what happened was apparently the rebels drove the Union troops off the field. Sheridan was up in Winchester. He came back down. He rallied the troops, rode across the front of the line carrying the flag, counterattacked and drove the rebels from the field, recaptured their camps, and unfortunately found a lot of dead Yankees, which they were really, really upset. I've been down there and done the reenactment at Cedar Creek, which they do right on the battlefield. And here is the monument 128th built on the spot where that happened. And Skip has been with me when we placed flags there for the fellas. It's a kind of a obscure, out-of-the-way kind of a place, but, those were our guys. So for a couple of years, we remembered them. Ah, there they are. I should have known I did that. Here is Rensselaer Mosier. I don't have a foil for that. Rensselaer Mosier. And there is his friend, George Payne. These are post-war images, but they're images that we didn't have before. So, he did, but I think he was always sickly. And both of them were very active in the GAR after the war. You see them, their names are on the roster of the Hamilton Post in Poughkeepsie. So they were busy. They did things, which is really good.
Jimmy, did Payne live up on Huns Lake Road up where, up near Sue Grove's house?
I think so. There's a number of Paynes in the census.
Right.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that's where. One of the other ones, the big families that had a lot of people from it were the Sacketts. And now the old farmhouse that used to be Roseland Ranch was where the Sacketts were. They had 13 kids. And they lost 2 kids. One was for whatever reason, he was in an Indiana unit. and another one was in the 128th, and both of them died of typhoid down in New Orleans. And Amos Travis, of course, we spoke about from the 20th, was shot through at Antietam, had a brother who was in the 128th and also died of typhus. And when you look at Amos Travis's stone, and it says, only sons of Anna and Martin Travis, it's really kind of sad. It brings it home to you that the war was really a hard war. And I know that when Stanford lost Pete Miller, our whole town was in mourning because everybody knew Pete. You know, he was a great guy. He was one guy. They lost 33, and they all quieted right down. No road, no school, no nothing is named for any of them. So we put up a statue. I thought it was due. Here is the grand review of the Union armies after the war. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the North Carolina and all that kind of stuff because I'm going to put everybody to sleep. But here's the grand review. Lincoln has already been assassinated. Johnson is the president at this point. It's a 2-day parade in Washington, D.C. down Pennsylvania Avenue. The great part about it is this is an image of the 20th Corps marching. Now, I particularly love it because that's a very well-positioned unit marching right now with their pieces up. It looks like at right shoulder shift, Pete. And it's a well-ordered regiment. I like to think that's the 150th right there. So there we have the 20th Corps on the grand review with an officer or a horse in front of them, which is very cool. And the Poughkeepsie Eagle, of course, was the paper at the time. And this is what it looked like. My cousin Steve allowed me into the Poughkeepsie Journal to play with their microfiche a little bit, and this came from there. Let the Eagles scream, the war, glorious news, official from Secretary Stanton. The Army of the Potomac conquers and generally surrenders. The closing of the war. The 150th returned home to a tumultuous explosion of people into the city. Some 40,000 people are said to be there for this parade when the 150th came home. Somewhere around 400 guys left in the unit at that point, and sunburned and blackened and as irregular as any troops could be from Sherman's army. And but they were a crack unit, and everybody knew it. The Eagle from that day. 50,000, they say, in the city. Immense grand procession. Every town was represented. Clinton, Stanford, everybody had a representative or a float in this parade. 21st Regiment was there in full numbers. The fire laddies in their glory, etc. And they closed up this whole parade at what is now the Martin Luther King Park, where they had tables all spread with food and such. The regiment was disbanded. And I think they were allowed to go home with their weapons, weren't they? So, right, I've seen George Rhinus's rifle. Remember that? It's his. I was really happy to see that. I'd like to have owned it. It was a really nice piece. Here is from the yearbook. This is the Clinton float. And there are all the ladies from Clinton for that parade. I wish it was clear so you could see some signs or anything like that. But in some of the old photographs, the resolution just isn't there. But at least we have something. So there you have it. At the end of the war, the fellas come home and they go back. And as Ken Burns said in his TV documentary, they began to make war on the standing corn. And they began to do things that veterans always seem to do. Here's a picture. Oops, wrong way. This is the Hamilton Post Grand Army of the Republic Veterans Association. This picture would have been taken on Garden Street in Poughkeepsie, is it? And there is the Hamilton Post, right here. It was torn down, I think, about 20 years ago, sadly.
Yeah, the building that is now the Legion is not the same building.
Not the same building on that site, right. But there they are, old fellows with their white beards and such. and they were very active. They were a very strong political force for many years. And they earned it, though. You know, anybody who would stand up to a mini ball, to my way of thinking, has the right. But I have images of some other folks who were there. And of course, here we have Daniel Guernsey. This was from Brian Robertson's photograph collection. Daniel Guernsey was a captain in the 47th New York Washington Grays. Made it all the way through the war from private right up to captain. And in the time this picture was taken, he was elderly and a judge. And here's all his family around him. This house was in Bangor, and it's gone. Yeah, it's gone now. It's sad that it's gone, but that's the place. And that's the only image I've found so far of Daniel Guernsey. Things keep turning up, though. You can never tell. Of course, this one you've seen, I think, already. That is Will Gurney and his family. And my great-grandfather, Asa, who I did not know. No, I'm not that old. Although, we should all recognize, I'm 66 this year. I was 6 years old when the last Civil War veteran died. He was a rebel. Here's the 150th at the dedication of their monument on Culp's Hill in Gettysburg. Of note there is John Henry Ketchum, right there, the old colonel. And he was, I think, a brigadier general at the end of the war. I believe that looks like, I don't know, is that Gildersleeve? And Captain Wooden? And a number of other folks that are spread around. Probably, if we had any kind of photographs that were marked, we'd be able to pick them out. And over here is a monument to the Maryland unit. Is it the Maryland or is it the Ohio?
Maryland.
Maryland. It's the Eastern Shore? Eastern Shore? Or these things have a way of showing up over the years. And especially now with the internet as active as it is and with eBay and things, photographs show up. Here are more veterans at the 150th monument. We don't know who these guys are. We know they're veterans. Why else would they sit there? Some of them are anyway. Some of them are pretty old. Here's an image taken in 1913. I believe, Mike, you have the original of this?
I think so.
Of interest to us here particularly are several people. Right here is Albert Knapp. That's Mark Burdick's great-great-uncle. And over here is Will Gurney, my great-great-uncle. And over here is Platt Curtis. Right there, right on the end. That's Platt in his older years. This is also Captain Cogswell from Company A. And there's the monument you can see behind them.
Jimmy, is that from the Poughkeepsie Journal, or where's that from?
This is from a postcard that was generated after the event by Captain Cogswell, who at that time lived in Pennsylvania. Now, Captain Cogswell didn't like this photograph. So if you see the original, you can see that his face has been changed and a new one superimposed on the one that he likes. Right? You've seen that. So, so that's why his head looks a little larger than the other ones. But it's very collectible. You can find them occasionally, but I mean, I found this from Toby Collins, who has a knack for picking up things like this. Here's a photograph from Mike Peets. And here are the fellows. Also, I believe this is what, is this 1913 also?
I think it's earlier.
And some of the fellows in the regiment went back to Tennessee, and this is on Lookout Mountain at the New York Monument. Amongst the folks that are in this picture, Albert Knapp again, Will Gurney, and there is Judge Gildersleeve, right there. I believe up here, this is Sergeant Reines from Millerton. And there's a couple other ones that I think we were sort of able to ID, but we're not really too certain of them. But in any case, they're all wearing their little pins. They went to Resaca, to the battlefield at Resaca, and saw where they were. They went to Lookout Mountain. I'm sure they went down to Atlanta. I know amongst the things that they had from Sergeant Reines was some cotton from the battlefield at Resaca.
They did something every year then to commemorate the group?
They generally would have, well, usually it would be every year, but if they couldn't do it, they would put it off a little bit. The badges that they had from those things are very collectible now. And I know one of the reunions for the 128th was right here in Stanford. Another one was in Pine Plains. And so the 150th usually was in Poughkeepsie, but they had what they call campfires and get-togethers in Gettysburg, where they would all get together and tell stories. And the fun part about that was you learned more from their get-togethers and their recounting of the stories than you would. And sometimes they're a little sketchy because you're not sure how true they really are. You know, the guys would tell the stories and there would be a little bit more to it than that. But one of the great ones I like was they invited the old chaplain from the 13th New Jersey with them. And the 13th New Jersey was brigaded with them in the 20th Corps. And they had gone into Milledgeville, which then was the capital of Georgia. And they held a mock session of the Georgia legislature and rescinded the vote of secession. So, but they didn't do that until after they had liberated a couple of barrels of whiskey. And according to the chaplain, rendered the better part of both regiments dysfunctional. So, and of course this came out at the campfire in Gettysburg when they were all together. It was on the occasion of their dedicating the monument, I believe. Here's a print of the National Rifle Association rifle team. And that is Judge Gildersleeve down below and him right here. And as I said, they defeated the Irish and the English in target shooting. And they were quite accomplished at it. And it was a big deal back in those days to be able to handle. It was a manly art of handling your weapon and being able to shoot anything. Of course, this was in the days of Annie Oakley and all that kind of thing. So when I started this project, I started looking around. And one of the first things I did was I tried to find the stones. And in my mind's eye, I started to tally and keep a tally. Who was I going to find more of? 128th, 150th. I was going back and forth. I'd find 2 or 3 128th. I'd find 5 or 6 150th. I'm like, holy cow. I found Edward Fraser, and I was like, 11th Heavies. Who the heck is this guy, you know? I had to look him up in the census to find out he was a black guy. And that he had been down in, well, later on I found references to him in other places. That's where I found that he had lived up on Stissig Mountain. And he'd had 4 children that were stillborn. So, I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, this poor guy, he had a tough life, you know. Now, let me tell you another thing about Edward Fraser and where he's buried. He's buried as part of the Evergreen Cemetery, the First Baptist Cemetery out the corner of Millis Lane and 82. At one time, the church was over to the east of where it is right now, and it was picked up and moved right to the corner of Mills Lane and 82 to make room for the railroad. The Northern Duchess of Columbia came right through there. It split the cemetery. So what you have in the front are the regular old folks from the Baptist church, and literally on the other side of the track is the black cemetery.
With markers? With headstones?
These were well-to-do people. They were not poor people. Many of those stones have scripture on them. They're big and they're well documented. So they are, you know, they're not poor people. But they ended up on the wrong side of the track. I didn't even know they were there for many years.
What's really lucky for the society is that Jimmy and a couple of other men from town, I think it was 1993 you did it?
Yeah.
They uncovered the cemetery because it had been really grown over.
Yeah.
And what they did is they made a map and they documented all the stones that were there at that
Yeah.
point. And if you go there now, the cemetery's in really bad shape. And a good number of the stones are down. But we're so lucky because we've been doing all the cemetery restoration that now we know what to look for from Jimmy and everything Mick did.
Yeah, that was, I was really happy to do that because I'd heard there was a black soldier back there, and I was like, black soldiers? We had a black soldier? Wait, how can I know this? So that's where Edward Fraser is, anyway. And his stone looks exactly like that. So it's an overgrown area, but, you know, the folks have been keeping it clear I'm so happy. I'm really proud of you guys for the work you've done. This is in the same cemetery, one of the earlier ones that I found. Here's Nathan Preston's grave. You can see it from the road. The folks have been putting a grave there. It says 90th New York, Company I. Very simple. His father is there, and his wife is there, his wife who died of some sort of sickness while he was away in the service. Now here are the Sacketts that I mentioned before who had died of typhus down in New Orleans. And next to them, one of the Martins and Amos Travis Stone. It's very touching when you see them. Because as I said, it says on the bottom there of this, only sons of Anna and Martin Travis. This had an impact on me. So I went to, then at the time it was President Oliver Orton, and said to him, we need to do something. You know, I mean, this has been forgotten for a very, very long time, and we need to do it. Here's Talmadge Woodstone. Now, he's not there. He's buried in Gettysburg. But they did this for him. And you can see there's Lydia, 1866 when he passed. His house is just outside of town. As you pass the Cobble Pond Farm, there's like an open field, and on the right, the first house that you come to is his house. Just a little house. Charlie Mahoney had lived in it for many years. But anyway, Talmadge is not there, but his wife made a stone to him. So in '94, we decided we would do a monument. And that's from the Poughkeepsie Journal, and Stanford will build a monument. Now, the bad part to me about doing this monument was that when we actually got everything together and were ready to unveil what the prototype was going to look like, it coincided with the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. You can't, you know, I mean, I didn't want to take away from those fellas because I'm a huge fan of the World War II fellas, but that's what happened. And as I mentioned, I talked Peter Wing into doing it. I have this image someplace. It's a really good image, taken by Pete Wing's daughter, and it was after the bronze statue went up. Now, this was supposed to be done in a concrete composite. That was what the plan was. There were different composites around the country that we had found. We thought this would be the way to go. Pete wasn't satisfied with that. He approached one of our wealthy residents and asked him to make a contribution and help us do this thing in bronze. The man made a contribution. So down we went to the Talix foundry and had it cast in bronze. In any case, that was a town councilman who was that wealthy guy. Anybody know? Want to take a guess who it was? He wanted to be kept as anonymous, but I don't care. It was really great. I mean, that he would do this. Think about it for a little bit. Anyway, that's a great shot of Pete and one of his friends in front of there. He was very proud of this. Nope. Keep going. We dedicated it, and we actually dedicated the prototype. That morning, Peter Wing went into Artie DeMillis with the prototype and demanded that he be able to buy the men a coffee. Artie DeMilla then lectured him on how his tax dollars shouldn't be going for anything like this. Peter then delivered a blistering lecture about how that was not the case. If you know Pete, or knew Pete rather, you knew that he let him have it pretty good. Artie usually deserved it. My friends from the 150th at that point I had joined the 150th Regiment for a variety of reasons, and my friends showed up there and dedicated the bronze statue with me in 1996. There it is. And there are several people that are here today. There is Lieutenant Pete, who is right there. And there is then Sergeant, well, it looks like Corporal. Were you a corporal at that time, Michael?
I guess so.
Yes. Well, and that's me as a high private. But it was great fun. And there was a number of people who made this possible. One thing, Eric Sprossel, who lives here in town, is a mason by trade. He does other things now for a living. I had no idea how to mix cement or lay stones or do any of those kind of things. Eric volunteered his time. And he said, if I mix the mud, he'll do it. And I said, okay, we're doing it. So Al Christensen, God bless him, had his fellows dig us a nice 6-foot hole here, which we filled with a nice concrete block base, filled it up with stones and bricks, and then concrete on top of it, and then built up. So this thing actually goes about 8 feet down into the ground, from his feet down. And initially, he was supposed to be a little bit higher, but this ended up being, I thought it would be better if we just leave it where it is so kids can touch his feet or do whatever, and not make it so unapproachable as to be a godlike thing. Campbell wouldn't like that. It is an image of Cornelius Campbell. That's who Peter picked. However, there's some issues with it. He gave him a 5-button tunic instead of a 9-button tunic, which I was picking on him quite a bit about. And also, if you were to stand on top of this monument and look at his epaulets, he has a lieutenant's bar, not a major's bar, which I didn't see until the bronze piece came back. I was like, Peter, he was a major, right? And then, expletive deleted. He wasn't happy. But the idea is he has his hand in his chest on a Bible and his other hand on the sword. He's ready for war or peace. Now that's Cornelius Campbell, and the good part is he has him looking down the road at his house, which I like. So pretty much every year since then, we've tried to have some fellows come back and take part in the wreath laying at the statue. When you have so many that have been killed and have been forgotten for so long, it's important that we make up ground and do these things and not forget that we lost some good guys. And they were young men, 18, 19, 20 years old. And they shouldn't be forgotten. So when you drive through town and you see this statue, it's not just for people that never existed. They're real people. Before the lilacs really took off, it was just a real pretty spot. I was really happy. I used to sleigh ride there when I was a kid. With that, I'm happy to say that our overhead projector made it all the way through the presentation, and I am done. Thank you. Any questions, anybody?